Morning, everyone, and extra good early morning to the Canadians who've joined at crack of dawn. So to just kind of get into this, is the big question is why bother to measure emotions in the workplace? And the really big question is that it's normal to experience emotions at work. You have frustration, anger, excitement, but how leaders handle emotions in the workplace can go a long way to building or destroying the workplace climate, as well as motivating and encouraging or discouraging employees. So sometimes you really do need to see the bigger pictures of how your employees see you. And it's sometimes hidden from you. You don't always really know. And that's why one of the reasons that it's really important to measure emotions, because you get a background knowledge of stuff that you wouldn't normally have. Emotions, for better or worse, influence a myriad of factors within the workplace. And this is just a handful of them. It influences employee commitment, creativity, decision-making, work quality, the likelihood of your employees sticking around, and obviously the effect of the bottom line. To start with, I'm just going to look at some of the latest neuroscience information on decision-making and creativity and how emotions play a very, very significant role in this. So to start with, neuroscientists have estimated that our five senses transmit 11 million bits of information to the brain per second. At the same time, you actually can only really compute about 30 bits of information in your consciousness in the same period. So there's a significant amount of neurostatistical processing that's going on in your brain that's looking through all of this information that's coming through to you. And the only way that your brain is able to transmit this information quickly to your consciousness is through a gut feeling or emotion. So the idea that you have emotions on one hand and logic on the other, and never the twain shall meet, is such a huge misnomer. For example, if you look at the adverts on, I think it's Alan Gray, who says, you know, keep emotion out of decision making when it comes to investments, just shows how very little people understand of emotions. So one of the leading researchers on emotion is a guy called Damasio, who basically believes that it is one of the biggest flaws of humankind to believe that decision-making occurs in a vacuum of logic and common sense. He actually believes that your decisions or your answers unfold very, very slowly and sketchily in your mind. But how it does it is that it actually kind of scans the environment and it kind of calculates past experiences and it gives you a fleeting gut feel. So you get an answer of what the right thing is, a symbolic form, in a very, very emotional symbolic form. But we don't understand that. So we get a feeling about it and then we say, oh, this is the decision we've made. And quite a lot of research that has gone on in, say, for example, into just deciding which car to buy. Because we don't understand the emotional content and how decisions are made, we often come to the decision, but then retrospectively assign logic to it so that it makes sense to us, because we just really don't get how it works. So in terms of looking at this big picture and how it influences your emotions, the big question is, are some emotions really, really bad, or are good emotions, too much of a good emotion, a bad thing? And the answer is yes and no. In some ways, in terms of really getting the sweet spot of success in the workplace, a certain amount of stress is essential for you. And are very high levels of stress, if you kind of go over the sweet spot, then cognitively, perceptually, and emotionally you become impaired. So it's almost like trying to find the perfect fit between having some stress and having no stress. And in terms of looking at how we kind of balance it, there is a researcher called Richard Boyatas, who is quite an interesting character. He actually started his career as an aeronautical engineer and went on to work at NASA, and he was literally a rocket scientist. He was designing the latest space technology and decided that after a while this really wasn't for him. So he decided to go back to university, and he just picked one short course that he needed as a credit. And the reason he picked this course was because it actually said no tests. And he ended up falling in love with the idea of industrial psychology, and is now a professor of it. But his science background has really helped him do his research in a very multidisciplinary method. So he's always looking at his research, not just from a psychological perspective, but from a very scientific perspective. And so this research that he has developed has been done in conjunction with neuroscientists doing fMRI studies to try and see what happens in the brain in certain instances. And so his theory basically is kind of built on other neuroscience theories, but his technology has helped him kind of take it a little bit further. And basically what he's saying is that in our brain, you have two different ways of kind of dealing with the world. One is the positive emotional tractor, which is the social network, your kind of good feeling. It's your parasympathetic nervous system. The associated emotions with this are awe, joy, gratitude, curiosity. And in this area, this is the area where there is out-of-the-box thinking, where there's creative thinking, where there's innovation. And I mean, we all know that almost every company that you come across now says innovation is one of our mission statements and our values. But do they really know how to get their employees into a state of mind that works well within this arena? What's also really interesting is that this state, this PEA is what they call it, actually alleviates stress. So being in this feeling of gratitude, of awe, where the parasympathetic nervous system is triggered, is what alleviates stress. The majority of people would say, oh, you know, let's alleviate stress in the workplace by decreasing your workload, by getting someone to help you. In fact, research shows that that's not how we alleviate stress. You actually have to have a bit better balance between the two states. Alternatively, the negative emotional attractor is the analytical solving part of your brain. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is associated with fear and anxiety. It is also your fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain and response to it. And it obviously triggers hormones, etc., that's associated with this. So we see the NEA, and even the name in a way intimates that it's a very negative state to be in. But without it, we actually can't function. So related to this is, for example, your amygdala, which is really the fear sense of your brain. Damasio, the neurologist, has actually shown that in patients where they've had an impaired amygdala, and there's a specific disease that later on in life starts to impair your amygdala, those people who had a fully functioning career actually start to decline significantly, because without some level of fear and stress and some level of that, you aren't able to activate the analytical part. You aren't able to have the motivation to work. So it's about finding the right balance between these two. But what's really fascinating about this is that these parts of the brain are mutually exclusive. So in a way, where one part of the brain is triggered, the other part is suppressed, and vice versa. So when you're in a positive emotional attractor state, your negative emotional, your analytical part of your brain is not working, and vice versa. And one of the things that's really, really important to remember about this is that it is essential for employers to understand this and to research this and to see what's happening within the employees. Because we have to understand that innovation, creativity doesn't happen sitting in front of a computer finishing a report. It happens when you're in a positive emotional state. And that's why when you look at a lot of the people who have had fantastic ideas, it hasn't happened when they're sitting, stressing, trying to get something done. It's happened when they're on a walk or doing yoga or in the bath or about to fall asleep or sitting under a tree where an apple falls on your head. And we have to measure and create enough states within the workplace that are conducive to both analytics and innovation. But taking this further, what's also fascinating about this is how much of both the positive emotional attractor state and the negative emotional attractor state are contagious. And it is passed on from one employee to the other within the workplace, which is what we're going to discuss now. So I want you to look at this picture and give yourself a couple of seconds, and probably you'll find that after a while, the majority of you have had to stifle a yawn just looking at the picture. And the reason is that from an evolutionary perspective, we are tasked with the notion of mimicking expressions for socialization. So we're hardwired to actually pick up on emotions around us. Just sensing negative emotions stimulates the fight or flight or freeze defensive position of this within us. And what's so interesting about this is that it happens so fleetingly. It takes about 8 milliseconds for the message of a threat to go from our 5 senses to our amygdala. That's 8,000th of a second, and which is way below conscious recognition, which is typically about 500 milliseconds. And the thing about it is that what we don't completely even really understand is how this happens. So we're aware that part of it happens through mimicking emotions. So say, for example, if you walk past somebody in the street and you smile at them and they smile back, that is a form of mimicking emotion. And they've shown that just by smiling, you do feel an emotion because your body is sending you a message that you're happy, and so you reciprocate by smiling. I think the only place that maybe doesn't happen that much is New York. If you ever walk down the streets in New York, they're not great at smiling back at you. But in the rest of the world, generally, there's some reciprocal emotional contact. But what they're saying is that there are quite a few different degrees to it. So sometimes it is a very fleeting emotional state that occurs below consciousness, but it still registers a behavioral differentiation. So for example, the study was done in 2003, and basically what they did was they got 3 groups of people together. And they were trying to ascertain how emotions influence drinking fruit juice. So it wasn't alcohol, it wasn't anything that would have some other hidden reasons, it was just fruit juice. The first group had exposure to happy facial expressions, but they were fleeting, they were microfacial expressions. And those respondents poured 50% more fruit juice than those exposed to neutral expressions. Conversely, the subjects exposed to angry expressions poured and consumed even less fruit juice than those exposed to neutral expressions. But what was so fascinating about the project is that not one single subject reported a conscious awareness of people around them showing them these fleeting and microfacial expressions. So on a non-conscious level, and it's a term that they use to kind of try and differentiate from the deep, dark unconscious. On a non-conscious level, people are aware of very fleeting facial expressions, even though they aren't necessarily aware of it on a conscious level. There's also some indication that when, for example, you are all in a meeting together, that there is physiological synchronicity that occurs in that meeting. So suddenly people's heart rates start to correspond and to sync, and blood pressure and physiological responses, which how exactly that happens, we don't completely know. At the same time, there's a Dutch researcher called De Groot who has looked at chemosignals, and he basically has researched emotional contagion in the concept of smell. So he has confirmed that humans can actually smell fear. Their findings are a little bit slightly more inconclusive when it comes to happiness, but there are some emotions that conclusively, for some reason, we're able to smell. So the person who was exposed to the fear emotion or attractor or instance that created the fear wasn't even present. It's the clothes that they were wearing were then put into a packet, and the participants in this project was given an opportunity to smell and then record what emotion they thought that smell signified. So as well as the idea of microfacial features and physiological syncing, there is a lot of emotional contagion that is happening in the workplace that happens way below the radar of consciousness, that we don't really even completely understand how it happens, but it does happen. And so it's essential to be trying to measure what is happening in the workplace, because before you know it, it does become a pandemic of emotions, where emotions are kind of switched and spread around the workplace. So getting into how QI examines some of the emotions that we have in the workplace. Just to start off with, QI has shown that if you ask people a spontaneous recall of emotions, on average, people typically mention 1 to 3 emotions. And incidentally, this has actually been corroborated by Brené Brown, who has done a lot of research on emotional granularity. And what she has said, exactly the same thing. She said that on spontaneous recall, her respondents recalled on average 3 emotions. And the top emotions were, according to her, pissed, happy, and anxious. In the QI process, they've got what they call an identikit. It's a list of emotions. And of the 100 emotions, there are more emotions on their list, but of the core 100 emotions, when they ask people that and the question would be just thinking about your general emotions at work or your general feelings in your life, just click on the ones that you believe are relevant to you. On average, 16 to 38 emotions are recalled. So I'm just going to introduce you into how QI presents their data. So if you imagine the brain divided into the right and the left side, I do know that that's a misnomer, that neuroscientists have proven that there isn't this clear left logical and right creative side, but just kind of metaphorically go with us here. And kind of all of the data in terms of measuring of emotions, of value statements, of personality, of corresponding behavior is all plotted on this kind of approach where you have the creative, the relationship, the artistic, the analytical, conformity, but competent and reliant part. So this is pretty much the essence of the QI map. You have in the middle is the core emotions, which are essentially your Garden of Eden, your perfect emotions that correspond to all of the different zones and segments here but are in the core. This part here represents positive emotions, and this outer rim represents the more negative emotions. This is an example of a lot of the statements on a map. So bear in mind that these statements aren't all randomly positioned, but they're based on about 60,000 interviews that QI have done. And their statistician has done regression and correlation analyses to make sure that they're positioned in the same way. He's also done a whole lot of other statistical analyses that my Stats 101 at varsity don't allow me to understand, but they are these statements, emotions, values, behaviors are all very, very statistically sound and calculated. All of the information that we put on to try and get the information through is put onto a heat map. So kind of keeping on with the metaphorical vision of a brain scan where you kind of have the red part which shows lots of activity and high levels of purpose on this part, is the red one which shows that there's a high level of activity in these areas all the way going down to blue. Of course, it says 100%, but we know that in all research, it's always very unlikely you have 0 and 100, but the red refers to the highest statements. And this is an example of a very, very small research project that we did in South Africa, which looks at the affluent and the poor, which kind of like looks at, in a way, the old adage of happiness, you know, money can't buy you happiness. But I think we can see that although money can't buy you happiness, it does significantly give you less misery. Because if you can see here, the affluent have quite a strong showing in the core, which is a very, very positive emotions. As do the poorer people, they also do have a lot of positivity. But you can see on the outer rim where there's a lot of negativity, there's a significantly higher proportion of negative hits than in the affluent. This is examples that were done in Canada of some research, which I think is really, really fascinating. And this is an example of a personality question where they asked them to say, if you could think of the personality of Warren Buffett, please click on the factors that you think are relevant to him. And you can see that obviously he's very well liked. There's a lot of heat within these areas. What's interesting is that you can see where it occurs. It definitely occurs in the more logical, analytical part of it, and less in the relationship, excite, delight zones. So there's definitely a skew towards where the positivity occurs. And the only negative showing is that he's quite intense, but generally there's quite a lot of positivity there. This is an unpopular sports executive. This in South Africa probably is what we would term a bit of a poople. I guess the Canadians are much nicer people than us, so they don't use bad terms. But if you look at the hits of this person, you can see that there's very, very little showing of positivity. The positivity is successful, passionate, interesting, entrepreneurial. But the negative ones are unpleasant, complex, bad-tempered, a bullshitter, dishonest, unreliable. And this is a good example of what we could measure and how you could see of how people would respond to different characters within the workplace. So these charts are of companies. These are examples of different companies overall. So in this example, we are asking the employees to say, if you're thinking about your feelings at work, generally, how do you feel? And you can see in this part here, there is very few or little core positive emotions. And the only real strong scoring of high scores occurs within the negative area. This middle one here, you can see there is a fair amount of positivity within the middle part, but obviously still a fair amount of negativity on the surrounding outer cores. This is a very ideal place. There's a lot of positivity you can see, And what's interesting about this is that the positivity occurs in all zones. So it's a very, very balanced place. This is an example of a staff survey we did within a South African company. And this was to try and get an idea of how certain divisions or demographic factors can influence. So, for example, this chart shows where there's a predominantly higher showing of females in these emotional categories versus males. So you can see that there is a higher showing of overall positivity amongst the females, which is generally not overly common within staff surveys. Normally it's the opposite. But this company in particular has a very strong value sentiment, and they are very, very focused on emotions and incorporating values into the workplace, which was quite well responded to from the female perspective. But you can see from the negatives that they experienced, they were fatigued, they had mixed feelings, and they were a little bit stressed. The men, on the other hand, were more kind of pessimistic, disinterested, irritable. So there were different positive as well as negative emotions that predominated within these different sectors. This is an example of one of the studies where you were asked how you would describe your boss. So it's also a very, very similar kind of thing where there is positivity, but positivity in specific zones. And this we would be able to say, you need to ensure that there's more balance across zones to try and make sure that you have more synchronicity with your staff, more motivation, more encouragement, and you're able to give recommendations in terms of how you would pull people into other zones. The idea of this is that you could also use this to predict behaviors and give overall scores in terms of pre and post interventions. So this is an example of the personality of a brand. So this question basically says, thinking about this brand. So if we had to say, for example, take a brand in South Africa and say, okay, thinking of, say, Tiger brands, what are the core personality characteristics that you regard as significant to this brand? We are then able to say, these are the predicted behavioral outcomes of this personality. So, for example, these traits of detached, boring, pessimistic, sad indicate that there is a lower chance of people purchasing the brand. They're likely to avoid it, to boycott it, to complain, to unsubscribe. This, for example, is a more positive example where they see the brand as cool, young at heart, popular, open-minded, remarkable. The corresponding behaviors are, I would order it, I'd regularly buy it, I'd recommend it, I'd try it, think about buying it. So you can see how there's a corresponding behavior. Of course, in the workplace, it's not quite that simple, because when you're talking about an emotion in the workplace, you can't definitively say this will be the corresponding behavior. You can intimate that you would have the possible behavioral outcomes. But for example, if we take the example of anger as an emotion, if you think about when you feel angry, or for example, when I feel angry, I react very, very differently from a behavioral context depending on the circumstance. So for example, if I'm angry with my kids, I might shout. If I'm angry with my boss, I might burst into tears, or I might become very sullen and quiet, or I might, to the worst degree, sit and plot the person's demise. Your responses, your behavioral responses to one emotion can differ. But we can say that there is a good chance that if there's a high level of anger or a high level of pessimism in the workplace, there'll be a lot of criticizing, there'll be a lot of complaining. If there's a high level of anger, there's a higher chance of shouting. There'll probably be corresponding high levels of lying, because you don't want to get into trouble if you do something wrong. So there are intimations that those behaviors could be associated with it, but it isn't definitive. This will absolutely happen if there is this emotion. This is an example of the Canadian study where they asked people how they felt pre-Olympics. Looking at the pre-Olympic map, you can kind of see how there were some positives but a lot of negatives. And these scores give you an idea of how many core positives there were, what the overall score is of these zones, and what the overall positive to negative score. Bear in mind that the positive to negative score isn't necessarily just a 1 positive to 1 negative. It is statistically calculated on the rating of how influential the negative or positive emotion could be on other factors, which we'll get to in a moment. And this is quite interesting because it also shows you the post-Olympic map. So you can see post-Olympics, there was a significant increase in positivity in all of the zones and overall, especially within core. So this is a way of showing if you have an intervention in the workplace, pre and post intervention, to see the success of it. Bob and I also worked on a persona barometer. So this is kind of like a brand barometer that we just did for a large client of ours. If you look at this barometer, the first part is really negative territory. So that is where you have a negative score because there's a significantly higher proportion of negative personality statements made about your brand. And once again, just to reiterate that it's not necessarily a 1 versus 1 emotion. For example, if you run an analysis by dependent variables of buy, use, and recommend, statistically speaking, there's a 63% impact of these dependent variables by negative traits. So there's a much, much higher influence of negative traits. So you have to balance out the positives and negatives to make sure that your positives override the higher proportion that the negative trait is given in terms of your dependent variables, which is in reality is true of everything in life. For example, you can get a lot of positive feedback, but that one negative comment is the thing that would stick in your mind. And it's no different in terms of workplace or brands, for example. So this part here, just to go back to the barometer, is really the negative territory. That's where you have significantly higher proportion of negative statements about your brand. And this is the part where people will be actively discouraged from using it. This is the part where people start to show signs of loyalty and they'll start to use the product. And this is the part where there's significant advocating and endorsing and actively encouraging others to use the product. Our client was sitting at 16%, which kind of showed them that they actually were still, their clients were still in the considering phase. They weren't really absolutely adamant that they were going to start purchasing this product, but they were kind of in the considering phase. So these are just examples of how these barometers, pre and post testing, could be used, although they weren't used in staff surveys per se, that they can be used within the workplace to measure emotions and personality and your overall brand and your overall value, and to assess not only how your employees are feeling, but how interventions can alter for better or worse the feelings and emotions of your employees. So that's the presentation. If you have any more information, please don't hesitate to visit the QI Value Systems website. And just to end off, remember, we are actually just all basically houseplants with complicated emotions. So, you know, I think it's important to remember that we all have emotions. They all influence our behavior and our decision making. And just because emotions are not always that well understood doesn't mean that it isn't an important part to investigate within the workplace.